just would like to call this meeting to order of the Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment Subcommittee. Before getting started, I would always like to acknowledge my colleagues that we are joined by. We have Senator Edwards, the veteran of the organization, the committee. We also have Senator Mike Jackson, and we're also joined by Senator Johnny Ray Sailing. Today, we'll hear 3 agency reports. We'll hear about the Office of State Prosecutor, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, and then we'll also hear from Dpscs, Police and Correctional Training Commissions. At this moment, I'd like to bring up Mr. Caleb Weiss to give us the analysis report for the Office of the State Prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get started. Can everyone see the document on the screen? Okay, getting started with the presentation. First here we have the summary for the increase in the budget. The fiscal 2023 budget allowance increases by $62,000 or 3.5%, which brings the total to 1.8 million in fiscal 2023. Moving forward to Exhibit 1, which is an overview of the agency spending. As you can see here, the personnel comprises 85% of the agency's fiscal 2023 budget allowance. This is similar to prior years. The next 2 largest areas of expenditure are supplies and IT expenses at 9%, and then all other areas of spending comprising 6%. For the change in the budget, the major changes here are in the personnel. As you can see, regular earnings increasing by 21,000 in fiscal 2023. However, I would like to point out in non-personnel expenses, the new case management system contract down here, which increases the budget by 25,000. This is the final spending to complete the new case management system, which will increase the Office of State Prosecutor's information technology capabilities. Moving forward to the managing for results section. In corruption cases, we're asking that OSP should comment on its work with the independent investigation of police misconduct and how this work overlaps with the Office of the Attorney General's Independent Investigation Division, which began its work during the current fiscal year. Then down to the exhibit. This is Exhibit 3. This is the corruption cases. As you can see in fiscal 2021, the complaints received grew dramatically to 192 complaints from 136 the prior year, and correspondingly, the investigations opened and the cases closed also grew fairly substantially as well. Moving ahead to election law, which is the other prominent type of case that the Office of State's Prosecutor handles. As you can see here in fiscal 2021, the number of referrals increased for this type as well. However, the number of enforcement actions did drop about 50% over the prior year, while the conviction rate maintains steady at 100%. Given that both of these 2 measures for corruption cases and election law cases have increased, we're asking that OSP should comment on the increase in referrals and complaints and the resulting impact on its personnel needs. And with that, I'll move on to the actions. DLS recommends concurring with the governor's allowance. And with that, I end my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. And at this time, I see no questions from my colleagues, so I would like to bring up Mr. Charlton T. Howard from our State Prosecutor's Office of the State Prosecutor and his team to give the agency report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As mentioned, my name is Chuck Howard. I'm the Maryland State Prosecutor. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and the other members of the committee about the important work of our office. I should note I'm joined here today by our Deputy State Prosecutor, Ms. Sarah David, and our Office Administrator, Ms. Jeannie Gunthrop. Our office has jurisdiction over a number of state-specific crimes, including those, and most importantly, those related to public corruption and election law violations. This year, despite the challenges presented by the pandemic to our investigative and prosecutorial efforts, our office has been still successfully charged several corruption cases throughout the state of Maryland. And that's important. And I want to highlight the geographic diversity of the jurisdiction that we need to cover. But we have, for example, as is probably familiar to many in the room, charged the former director of the Maryland Environmental Service and chief of staff to the governor for misconduct in office, felony theft, and other offenses, and the mayor of Cambridge, Maryland, for revenge porn. We have also charged and convicted the deputy director of the Cecil County Board of Elections and the mayor of the city of Glen Arden for misconduct in office. Notably, we've had a significant rise this year, as mentioned, in allegations relating to police misconduct, as well as prosecutorial misconduct. As an example, we have charged a former Baltimore City prosecutor for stalking ex-girlfriends using grand jury subpoenas, among other crimes, and a police officer in Prince George's County for kidnapping and illegal use of force while performing the duties of his office. In addition, we charged and convicted 8 correctional officers for a theft scheme involving over $400,000 in state funds. I note that all the individuals charged are presumed innocent. But I think these cases highlight the work of our agency as specific examples, striving to ensure continued trust in our government institutions throughout the state while trying to manage the breadth of our jurisdiction throughout. I obviously cannot discuss any cases that have not been charged, but our numbers, as Mr. Weiss demonstrated, do show a 71% increase in corruption and police misconduct complaints received over the past 2 years. In addition to corruption cases, our office handles all election law violations throughout the state. One attorney in our office handles over 500 referrals from the State Board of Elections each year, in addition to handling corruption cases and other election law investigations and prosecutions throughout the year. The variety and complexity of the cases that we prosecute would make it appear that we had more than 4 prosecutors, including myself, and 7 investigators working statewide. While our resources are very limited, through hard work to date, we've been able to accomplish our important mission. We appreciate the governor's allowance in our budget and concur with that allowance. Thank you so much for your attention and support of our office. We provide written testimony to address the DLS questions concerning specific questions about our future structure and future goals. I'd be happy to go more in depth in response to those specific questions from DLS, and we welcome any general questions also at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. I see no questions from my colleagues at this time, but I just had one. Can you just unpack in reference to the travel? It looked like it went up 600%. Just wanted to get a better understanding. For the travel for our office, we had a number of trials over the past year that were in probably as geographically far-flung locations throughout the state as you can imagine. We had several cases on the Eastern Shore. We had a case in Western Maryland. We've had cases in Baltimore City and Anne Arundel County. Our office is located in Towson. For the cases that we can support directly from here easily, there's not a lot of travel expenses connected with that. But for cases, we had a trial in Wycomico County, a trial in Dorchester County, and both those were multi-day trials that required our prosecutors and investigators that are working on the case, as well as witnesses involved, to be in those locations for several days at a time. And none of the witnesses and none of the prosecutors are residents of that area, so we have to pay travel expenses for them to stay and lodging. I'd also turn to our Deputy State Prosecutor, Sarah David, who was actually trying those cases on the Eastern Shore, to see if she can she wants to add anything and comment to those travel expenses.
No, I would just note that, again, that's an increase from when the pandemic began and trials were stayed. And so we had a lot more trials in a concrete period of time because the courts opened up for jury trials in that period. Does that answer your question, Senator?
No, it answers it very, very thoroughly. So thank you. I'm going to move on to Senator Michael Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. 2 questions. You said 71% increase in police corruption this year?
Yes, Senator Jackson. Go ahead, Sarah. Okay, so we did have a 71% increase in both in our overall corruption complaints, and a number of those were police misconduct complaints.
Got you. No, thank you. And secondly, on the Sarah, good to see you. Yeah, I have, during my first term as a member, we had an unfortunate challenge, but since then I've been working very closely with the Board of Elections, campaign finance, and Sarah and some others. So, I don't know if I missed the number. Did you mention a number of complaints or the percentage increase regarding election campaign finance challenges?
Sarah, did you want to respond to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Senator Jackson, for your leadership on those issues. And we appreciate your engagement on the election law issues as well. I believe in Mr. Weiss's presentation, he alluded to kind of the increase in election law referrals.
Right.
However, as you're very familiar with, Senator Jackson, our enforcement has decreased because our goal in election law referrals is compliance. So we had over 500 referrals, but we generally try to work out those cases, before they go to enforcement and reserve the enforcement for, the more egregious and intentional, corruption related to election law violations.
And I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you guys do great work there. So thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions from my colleagues, this will end the report out for the Office of the State Prosecutor. Mr. Howard, I just want to say thank you to you and your team for the due diligence. And we all get it, especially when you said it in your testimony, that the number of people that you have, but the mighty work that you're getting done with the number of people that you have. So we say thank you. And Caleb, just always thank you for your report out and due diligence and determination in reference to making sure that we understand what's going on with the respective agencies. So we say thank you. At this moment, I'd like to bring up one of our newer agencies, Maryland Department of Emergency Management. And we have Madeline Miller giving the report out for the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. Madeline, you're on the stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to now share my screen. I think it's successfully shared. So today I'll be presenting the first analysis for the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. Chapter 287 of 2021 established the new department on October 1st, 2021 by combining the Maryland Emergency Management Agency and the Maryland 911 Board. In fiscal 2023, the budget increases $32.1 million or 9.1% to $384.9 million. Most of the growth in the agency's budget comes from additional disaster relief grant funding through FEMA. Though there's growth from the working appropriation, the allowance from this type of funding is only about 16% of what the department received in fiscal 2021. I have one item to note from fiscal 2022. MDEM received approximately $1.1 million in federal stimulus funds for the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program, almost $600,000 of which came from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, and about $520,000 came from the American Rescue Plan Act. The program provides grant funding to strengthen national preparedness and resiliency. It's funded with additional ARPA funds in fiscal 2023. Moving now to the overview of fiscal 23 spending on page 3, you'll note that only about 5% of MDEM spending is for its personnel and operating expenses, highlighted in this red and orange. The other 95% goes towards grants and distributions to local jurisdictions. These grants and pass-through funds are split pretty evenly between the former MEMA component and the 911 board component. So the split is about $182.4 million for the former MEMA and about $183.2 million related to the 911 board. This $138 million in disaster relief grant funds comes from FEMA, and I'd also like to note that the larger portion, the local pass-through grant for the 911 board, is money that's for the counties, and is generated by a fee that the counties set the level of. It's dispersed quarterly from MDEM and is collected alongside the 50-cent fee per each 911 accessible device, which is the state share of that. Next, moving to the proposed budget on page 4. As I mentioned earlier, the budget largely grows thanks to the addition of federal disaster relief grant funding in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That adds about $27.1 million and shows up as the 18.7% growth in federal funding for the agency. General funds, however, increased by 216% for various purposes, including $4 million for the Maryland Mesonet atmospheric monitoring system, $250,000 for the Maryland State Firemen's Association Widows and Orphans Grant, and $100,000 for consulting services for the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council. Growth in the budget is offset by the loss of 2 contractual full-time equivalent positions. Their removal also accounts for the reduction of about 42.1% in reimbursable funds for the department. I'd like to provide some additional information about the growth in general fund spending and have asked the department to share more with the budget subcommittee today in their written or oral testimony. So first, the Maryland Mesonet. This is a proposed network of automated weather observing infrastructure that will provide real-time monitoring information of weather conditions in the state. The department should comment on the state's need for the Maryland Mesonet, when it could expect to be deployed, and further identify a spending plan for the $4 million in fiscal 2023 spending. Secondly, the MSFA's Widows and Orphans Grant. Public Safety Article 7-23 allows MSFA to provide a death benefit to the spouse or dependent child of a volunteer fire company or rescue squad member who's killed in the line of duty. The grant funding for this benefit grows by $250,000 in general funds, and the department has reported that it expects this general fund increase to be permanent moving forward. Third and final for this section, there's the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council and consulting services for that purpose. The FSRC submitted its first interim report to the Maryland General Assembly on November 1st. MDEM did not author this report, but it's identified in the legislation which created it to co-chair the FSRC with the Montgomery County Food Council, as well as to staff the SFRC. We ask that MDEM comment on the adequacy of these funds to support the needs of FSRC and whether this funding could be one-time or ongoing in nature. Personnel data is discussed on page 6. In addition to the loss of the 2 contractual positions that I mentioned earlier, the fiscal 23 allowance includes the addition of 1 new accountant position. This position is necessary following the separation of MEMA from the military department, and positions within the Maryland 911 board component do not change from fiscal 22 to 23. Moving now to the key observations section that begins on page 7. Additional information about the tracking and reporting of COVID-19 public assistance funding may be of interest to the General Assembly. A significant portion of the state's COVID-19 response funds flows through MDEM. This is about $970 million between fiscal 21 and fiscal 22. State, local, and nonprofit entities apply to MDEM for funding to offset their costs associated with the pandemic response. Currently, there's 100% cost share with the federal government from January 2020 through April 1st of 2022. Initially, a 75% cost share had been proposed, but for now it remains at 100%. The fiscal 2023 allowance includes an additional $137.6 million in MDEM's budget related to disaster relief grant funding. DLS asked that MDEM comment on the amount of public assistance funding that has been obligated but not yet reimbursed from FEMA, an estimation of how much the state can claim, and how much reimbursement that the state anticipates receiving beyond those funds discussed above, and an estimation of when any potential additional funds would be added to the state budget. To the second issue, the 2021 Joint Chairman's Report required that MDEM convene a task force on preventing and countering domestic terrorism. The Joint Chairman's Report withheld $100,000 in federal funds for a report to be submitted describing the task force's recommendations on how Homeland Security grant program funding should be expended to combat domestic terrorism. In its report to the budget committees, the task force identified 16 sample capabilities that the HSGP funds are used to support the acquisition and sustainment of, but it did not note the amount of HSGP funds that were used to support any of the identified sample categories. The report also includes 14 recommendations and themes that the task force generated. MDEM did not specifically report the extent to which current spending does or does not align with the recommendations. And we include some bold language here to asking the department to describe further how the federal fiscal year 2021 HSGP award for the state was expended and for what purposes. We also are curious, we asked that MDEM comment on whether or not it has data to measure the extent to which domestic terrorism is a threat in Maryland, and ways for measuring, the ways in which the agency can make progress towards deterring and preventing domestic terrorism. The third and final observation regards improving emergency management performance measures for the department and begins later down on page 8. Current MFR data does not offer insights into the use of grant funds, but could offer additional insights into, could offer additional insight into grants management to make progress towards the department's first stated goal of acting as a good steward of funding and resources. MDEM attempts to maintain or increase investment in emergency management functions throughout the state. This MFR is reported in exhibit 3 of the document. The amount of federal grant funds awarded to Maryland jurisdictions is tracked through 5 different programs, which are the State Homeland Security Program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, Flood Mitigation Assistance, Emergency Management Performance Grant, and Urban Area Security Initiative. The gross dollar values for these 5 programs are shown here. And this may speak to the agency's persuasiveness in achieving additional federal funding, but it doesn't reveal much to viewers of the MFR data about how dollars were used or the department's ability to measure whether the resources are having an impact in the state. I'd also like to note that the pre-disaster mitigation funds, this is now considered a legacy program and has been replaced by the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, or BRIC, funding program. This change is difficult to note within the MFR just because it was recently enacted in federal fiscal 2021 or federal fiscal 2020, I believe. Successful grant management for these grants is tracked by determining the percent of subrecipients who meet closeout deadlines for MDEM and the percent of FEMA grants for which MDEM meets FEMA's closeout grant deadlines. Both have been 100% in recent years, but additional measures of grant management, such as a ratio of grant monitors to grants, may allow the department to gauge how effectively it's managing its caseloads over time. The Department of Legislative Services asked that MDEM comment on the significant increase in funding received by the state from federal emergency management grants in recent years, and how the agency has utilized or monitored the use of those funds to improve security and disaster preparedness in Maryland. Moving to the next exploration of MFR data. Current MFR could benefit from additional measures of resiliency and emergency preparedness, as MDEM's second goal is to prioritize risk reduction in order to enhance state resiliency. Exhibit 4 shows the percentage of jurisdictions with current FEMA accepted hazard mitigation plans. To influence this measure, the department engages in outreach and technical assistance to jurisdictions. And it's notable and positive that this measure reached 100% in fiscal 2021. Presenting information like this with data about recent hazards to the state could allow the department to demonstrate risk reduction over time or increases in resiliency over time. We also asked that the department comment on its success with respect to improving the hazard mitigation plans of jurisdictions and on any potential barriers to maintaining a 100% rate in future years. Finally, the current MFR data that's reported for the agency could benefit from data specific to the Maryland 911 Board. MFR data has previously been submitted as recently as the submission of the fiscal 2016 allowance. At that time, the MFR only included one outcome measure, however, the percent of 911 centers who had the technology and are receiving and responding to texts to 911 emergency messages. Additional information about Maryland 911 Board is typically reported in the Maryland 911 Board report to the General Assembly each year. So there are sources of data for the agency to build upon, but additional outcome measures may be appropriate to consider adding. The Department of Legislative Services has one recommended action for the agency's budget, which is the addition of committee narrative to require MDEM to develop more detailed Maryland 911 Board objectives and performance measures for the MFR section of the fiscal 2024 budget books and for subsequent fiscal years. That narrative is described and detailed a bit further on page 13 with specific requirements for potential MFR submission. That concludes my analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Miller, for such a detailed analysis. I see no questions from my colleagues. So at this moment, I'd like to bring up Acting Secretary, Mr. Russell Strickland and his team.
Thank you very much, Senator McCray and Senator Edwards, Jackson, and Solling. Thank you for having me here today. And a very special thank you to the analyst, Madeline Miller, who was very gracious and understanding with us during the process, as this marks our first budget hearing as a standalone department. Our mission in emergency management is to proactively reduce disaster risk and reliably manage consequence through collaborative work with Maryland's communities and partners. This past year, the Department of Emergency Management has demonstrated our ability to coordinate whole community efforts to accomplish this mission time and time again. I'm pleased to update the committee on these activities and respond to the issues raised and recommendations contained in the operating budget analysis prepared by the Department of Legislative Services. We have provided written comment on all of these comments as recommendations as well as comments. There's total of really 2 recommendations, of which we accept 100%. And then I think it's roughly 5 that we are providing comment on. And I'm prepared to go through and answer any specific questions you all may have on any of those. So at this time, I would ask if you have any questions.
Thank you, Acting Secretary Russell Strickland. I see no questions from my colleagues, but I would like to say on behalf, okay, I do have one. Senator Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I'm a little slow on that one, but Mr. Director, your group deals with the used to be 900 megahertz, and I think we went to the 700 megahertz. Is that correct?
It's correct. Yes, sir.
And you know, out in our neck of the woods out here in the mountains, sometimes it's hard with all these ups and downs and gullies and so forth to get everything connected up. Can you tell me, are all the towers up that were proposed in the original setup of the 700 megawatts?
I'd have to get back to you on that as to whether or not 100% of the towers are up. I know that's coordinated through the Maryland State Police as well as the Department of Information Technology. We've provided a fair amount of the funding that went into that through the State Homeland Security Grant Program, but exactly the status of all the towers being in, I'd have to get back to you on that.
I know there's a couple groups tied together here, but if you could, I know they were working at least on 1 or 2 more out here. I don't know if they finalized them or not. You know, Garrett County just built a new emergency management facility, which is centralized to the county. I don't know if you've been to it or not. I don't know if they're totally done. Actually, a store, pretty big store, and remodeled it, and it's right at the lake, which is central to the county. They don't have a tower there, and maybe this is something for the state police, but they tied in somehow to the state police tower, which is about 1.5 miles from there by the way the crow flies. Are you familiar with that? And is it working? And do they have everything in place they need at the new facility? I don't know if they can line or whether they can shoot a electronic line up to that tower without putting in a new tower so they can tie into this whole system.
Again, I'd have to check with John Frank, who is their local emergency manager, on that very specifics. And yes, I have visited that facility, and I can't say enough positive, and hats off to Garrett County. That facility was renovated using totally county resources during COVID. Instead of basically laying people off, they brought them in to renovate that facility and did an absolutely phenomenal job.
Yeah, we put a little bit of state money in there. It used to be an old hardware store, and I think will provide them the needs for many years to come down the road. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Strickland.
You're welcome, sir.
Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Russ. Welcome. This is a welcome sight for the state of Maryland. I think we should all be proud of finally getting to the point where we have a standalone agency to address the collaborative efforts that are necessary throughout our public safety efforts in the state. And also, it's a long time coming. We look forward to being your partners moving forward as this agency grows. So I just wanted to say that, Mr. Chairman, and just want to say welcome.
Yep. Mr. Strickland, I do have one question in reference to the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council. Can you just give the temperature in reference to whether it would continue? I know you kind of answered it in the written response, but what do you see the future, I guess, of the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council?
That's an excellent question, Senator, and I think it's going to be a necessary council to exist in a much longer period of time than what the original legislation has called for. I think it's focused on the challenge that we do not necessarily have one single point of which we can focus on that will cover all of everything that is in the food chain. And there are so many bits and pieces of it at the local level as well as the state level that it needs that kind of coordination. So it builds a synergy. So we have not only food where food needs to be, but appropriate food where that needs to be too. So I see that as a very long-term and a needed project.
Thank you, and look forward to working with you and in partnership with that effort. I just think that it's appropriate to say on behalf of all of our members of this respective subcommittee, just congratulations in your new role that you play with the department, and look forward to working with you. Seeing no further questions, this ends the part of the hearing for the emergency management, and now we will go on to the Police Corrections Training Commission, and we will hear that from Mr. Jacob Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like you just said, I'll be going over the budget of the Police and Correctional Training Commissions today. It is the smallest functional unit of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. It receives a 2023 allowance of $10.7 million and is fairly flat funded with the working appropriation, only an increase of $36,000. When we look at the various pieces this money goes to, the largest portion is personnel for operating the Public Safety Education and Training Center and administering the commissions. And about $2 million goes towards the expenses for operating that facility. Then there is the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission Police Training Fund, which was set up by statute a few years ago. Exhibit 4 shows spending for that over the past few years and the appropriations and fund balance associated. The yellow bar shows spending and the green bar show how much money is on the account. As you can see, spending has definitely been much lower than the appropriations. And so the fund balance has grown to a large amount. The main spending items for this fund have been the Learning Management System replacement, which is a major IT project. There's an appendix at the end that goes into more detail on what that project will accomplish. However, just know that it's the main system that the department uses for the commissions. There's also been funding going towards buying new SUVs for the driver training track, a new driver training simulator so that that driver training course isn't quite as overbooked as frequently, as well as other scenario simulators for police training and renovations along for the water training tanks. So as I said with the budget overview, there is not that much of a change in the working appropriation to the allowance. It's mainly in personnel, and in that it's a controlled object for health insurance. So this doesn't have much impact on the department's functioning. For vacancies, the allowance of positions is the same in both years. But as you can see in this chart, vacancies did start to climb up in fiscal 2022, starting in about October. They've been elevated over 10 vacancies for those few months. And it's something that the department could help to reduce. We went through the MPTSC fund items. Going to the performance evaluation for this agency. This chart shows the number of trainee days that were spent at the Public Safety Education Training Center in Sykesville. State agencies did not change much, but they're definitely lower in terms of trainee days than they were before the pandemic, as well as local, federal, and private agencies have been reducing the amount of time they're spending there. But I'll point out that Dpscs training, specifically for the entry-level correctional officer academies, has about doubled from 2020 to 2021. That's mostly because there's been an increase in hiring, so they've had to have more academies, and some of those were delayed in 2020 thanks to the pandemic. So 2021 had a bit of an extra amount in the beginning of that year. Exhibit 6 shows the percent of time these classrooms are being utilized. And overall, they're being utilized about 2/3 of the time in 2021. It's slightly less than 2020, but as you can remember, there were more lockdowns and a longer period in the pandemic for fiscal 2021. The classrooms get the least amount of use, while the skill areas like the driver training course and firearms training course receive the most utilization. I'll also point out that the department has added more simulators and labs, so there is less utilization, but there's more opportunities to use those for trainees. There is not much else I have to say about the agency. DLS recommends concurring with the budget's allowance. And if you have any questions or would like me to go into more depth on anything, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cash. Seeing no questions from my colleagues, I'd like to move on to Secretary Green for the agency and his team.
Very good. Good afternoon, Chairman McCray, members of the Senate Public Safety, Transportation, Environmental Subcommittee. Good day. For the record, my name is Robert Green. I'm the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. We have a bit larger than usual group with me today, so I'd ask for your indulgence for a moment as we go through introductions. I think it's important for you to meet the people that are doing the work and the leaders at PCTC. With me virtually today is Sasha Vasquez, our Acting Deputy Secretary of Administration, Rachel Sessa, our Chief of Staff, Nigel Roberts, our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Wayne Silver, our Director of the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission, Alan Beard, Director of the Correctional Training Commission, and Executive Director Al Liebno, who assists in overseeing both commissions and the public safety training facility as a whole, where we are also headquartered out in Sykesville. The department, as well as both commissions, appreciates the ongoing collaboration with the Department of Legislative Services, and as always, the hard work and thoughtful analysis of Mr. Cash. As you know, the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission is a quasi-independent body from the department. While I'm not a member of the commission, the agency does share staff and support the commission in terms of assisting with finance, procurement, human resources, and IT. To that end, I do think it's important to note that there are currently only 8 vacancies, full-time positions at PCTC, not 13. The majority of these vacancies are new, as 6 of them became vacant in the last 2 quarters of calendar year 2021. And we will continue to work to fill these positions with well-qualified individuals. With regards to the analysis, there was one issue DLS asked us to comment on, which is to expand on our vision and plan to expend the MPTSC fund resources while enhancing police training programs. To be clear, statutorily, it's up to the members of the commission to determine how to spend those funds. So I'd like to turn it over to Director Silver to respond to the issues. Before doing so, I'd also like to say the department concurs with the recommended action, which is to concur with the governor's allowance. Director Silver.
Thank you, Secretary Green. Members of the commission, the commission did not receive the first tranche of funding until the beginning of fiscal year 2020. Since the beginning of fiscal year 2020, the commission has expended $526,019 from its special fund. As stated in the analysis, a significant amount of the fund balance will be utilized for the implementation and subsequent maintenance of the new learning management system, LMS. We have set aside $2 million from the fund to offset the cost of the LMS. However, the department recently received bids on a 5-year contract, a contract that would cover implementation and maintenance of the LMS. The bids received range from $6.3 to $26 million. So the MPTSC funds will be critical to this project. The commission also plans to utilize a significant portion of its remaining fund balance to enhance training efforts by upgrading equipment and technology. To enhance police training, the commission plans on purchasing 3 additional virtual training simulators at a cost of $80,000 per unit and a total purchase cost of $240,000. The driver training facility also needs maintenance and upgrades in order to accommodate continued expansion of police recruit training needs and in-service training components. The commission estimates that enhancing training at the current driver training facility will cost $400,000. Additionally, the firearms facility, which is over 20 years old, needs technological and equipment upgrades. The commission has identified the need for 2 judgmental decision systems with new technology that provides greater instructor interaction and student de-escalation options. The commission is also seeking to upgrade the electronic range target system and range shoot house, which is a live fire decision-making training arena, by adding a system that will allow the walls to be reconfigured. Not only would this enhance training realism and instructor flexibility, but it would allow the training environment to change to address specific objectives. These upgrades to the firearms facility are projected to cost somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000. Collectively, these enhancements will allow the commission to improve the quality and effectiveness of training, specifically in the area of scenario-based training, while ensuring training is in accordance with all legal requirements. The incorporation of real-time instructor-student interaction will greatly assist in improving de-escalation training and evaluation by building on the strengths and improving the weaknesses of officer responses to tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving situations. Officer post-incident, to include duty of care responsibilities, can be monitored and evaluated in real time with this technology to ensure a firm comprehension of their responsibilities and understanding of the sanctity of human life. Because the technology allows multiple students and virtual role players, officers can easily be evaluated in realistic scenarios involving use of force and their duty to intervene. As you can see, we do have a vision and will continue to work with the department on utilizing the funds to make sure that these training enhancements are incorporated. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
And we are prepared to entertain any of your questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll go to Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary and your team, you guys do terrific work, and I appreciate your presentation. Mr. Silver, you spoke of the learning management system. Well, let me step back. So there's $2 million allotted by the General Assembly for the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission. I believe in your initial statements, you mentioned that part of the learning management system, the part of the $2 million for the learning management system, I'm sorry, the $2 million, part of the $2 million was going to be used toward that learning management system. If I stated that correctly, Mr. Secretary or Mr. Silver, is that typical within the confines of the part of the public safety and correctional services where your entities within the organization pay for that system? I just want to make sure that the dollars that we sent over for the Training and Standards Commission are going to the Training and Standards Commission. So,
thank you for that question, Senator. Mr. Liebno, you want to get into what aspects and how the learning management system serves both and how that's utilized?
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to. Thank you for that question, Senator Jackson. The learning management system is to replace, the process that we're doing is to replace a system that's been around since the mid-late 90s. This is a system that we track training certification requirements of the commission, and in fact, both commissions, correctional and the police commission, for officer certification, officer training, legislative mandates that require certain training. And what the biggest advantage that we're going to have with this new system is topical tracking of specific topics that are enumerated in current statute and commission regulations.
okay, thank you. If I may have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, both. I would be very curious as we move forward, and not me, the committee would be very curious as we move forward as the learning management system is transitioning. And I am familiar with those types of systems, and I know how, much of a monstrosity they can be and cumbersome they can be. So please keep us up to date on that transition, because as we have embarked since 2015-16 on criminal justice reform and, as a criminal justice reform, it's going to be vital for us to ensure that we have the proper information. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Jackson, for that question. Just like the Thank you, Secretary Green, as always, for your due diligence, your team's due diligence, and the work that you all do for Marylanders across our state. I'd also like to just re-emphasize the hard work that all of our analysts are doing. Jacob Cash, Madeline Miller, and Caleb Weiss and safety colleagues. This was the last briefing analyst report for our respective committee today. So we are adjourned. You all have a blessed Friday and a blessed weekend.
You as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Chairman. Have a good one.
Thank you too, Mr. Chairman. Have a good one. Take care. Yeah.